Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV, and we are completing our second week in the Torch to Tunis series. Joining me today is Ian Mitchell, who, after a career in both the Royal Navy and British Army, has turned to other projects, including battlefield guiding and various other projects. He is the author of this superb book, The Battle of the Peaks and Longstop Hill, which is the subject of today's show. So it's the first real occasion during this series we're diving into a mostly British battle with detail. Just again, a bit of housekeeping. We have new subscribers, new viewers. Views are going up on the channel. If you're new to the channel, welcome aboard. I will remind you the information you need is always in the description below. That's where you'll find links to my guests' websites. And in this case, if you go to Ian's publisher and put the code in that's in the description, you get a discount. So hooray, it will last till the end of July. So if I'm afraid you're watching this on catch up in a year's time, the discount doesn't apply, but you've got a couple of months or so to go and get this book. And I recommend it thoroughly. It's one of those ones, if you like your battles and maps and taking it through there, fantastic. But without further ado, I'll bring Ian in. So good evening, Ian. How are you today?
I'm very well, thanks very much.
So as I said on the top of the show, they're quite a varied career, traveled the globe, done a few things. What first drew you to Tunisia and the British Army's involvement in that campaign?
I think first of all, it was in 1997. I read a book by a chap called Geoffrey Blaxland called The Plain Cook and the Showman. And I subsequently went back to that in about 2007, 2008. And it was a holiday to Tunisia that really sort of prompted the interest.
Super, and it oops, there you are, I'll go back again. And it is an interesting campaign, and what we're finding out about it is it probably has a lot more significance in the development of tactics and doctrine than perhaps we realize. We kind of often leap straight from kind of North Africa to D-Day and the Italian campaign, but actually, despite the fact for the Germans things were sort of winding down, although people who fought against them there would say they're definitely not winding down, there were lessons to be learned. Anyway, folks, Ian has come armed with a PowerPoint. What we're going to do today is we're going to kind of power through the presentation first and then do questions at the end. But if there is a question that pertains to something that is actually on the slide about an individual or a particular town or aspect of the battle, we will address it as we go along. But essentially, I'm going to hand over to Ian to take us through this in his good time. So over to you, sir.
Thank you very much, Paul. What I plan to do is talk about a battle few of your viewers have probably heard of until recently, and I hope as a result to spark some interest in the long neglected campaign in Tunisia. You could say that a battle is a bit like a play or a film, and the Battle of the Peaks is probably no exception. I'm going to take this analogy and apply it to the story. So the Battle of the Peaks has a set, the terrain. It has a plot, the plan. It has special effects, weather, smoke, noise. It's got props, tanks and artillery. And of course, it's got a cast of actors. So to our set. First of all, this is a mountainous area located 30 miles west of Tunis in northern Tunisia. Despite its proximity to a capital city, it was then, and it is today, an isolated, treacherous and rugged area. The soldiers of the time called the fighting that took place here the Battle of the Peaks, because it seemed to them that they were taking just one peak after another. The commander of the First Army, General Anderson, described the area thus: "This mountain land is a vast tract of country. Every hill is large enough to swallow up a brigade of infantry." These two modern photographs perhaps help reinforce Anderson's description of the rugged nature of the terrain, and both these locations saw heavy fighting. In terms of understanding our set, the terrain, 5 kind of geographical features shown on this map are quite important. First of all, on the right-hand side, you can see, is the Medjeda River Valley. This provided a clear obstacle for movement, but it also provides the eastern boundary to our battlefield. The southern boundary is provided by the road that in 1943 ran from Beja in the west through Oued Zaga, bottom left of the map, through to Medjez El Bab. From Medjez two roads wind towards Tunis. The first north of the river, and the second going south and then northeast. The road north of the river is overlooked by a whole series of mountains. These are the peaks. And halfway to the town of Djebel, which is not on this map, there is a hill complex on that road, just above that road, that is comprised of two mountains, Djebel el Ahmera and Djebel el Ra. This is Longstop Hill. At the top of the map, and north of the town of Ouedzaga, runs the bed or the Tini Valley, and its valley is bounded on the west by Djebel el Mardi. The other feature is Djebel Tanngoucha, which overlooks Longstop Hill, and that's in the top right. I've talked about Longstop, the hill complex. This photograph shows Longstop. It was named by a cricketer, Bill Wilberforce, and cricket fans will know that Longstop is a fielder's position on the boundary of a cricket field. I'll talk about Longstop a little later. So I suppose the obvious question to ask is, how in brief did the British Army get to this location? And the answer is, quite simply, they landed 500 miles further west in Algeria in November as part of Operation Torch, and advanced to within about 30 miles of Tunis before being stopped by the Germans in December. The race for Tunis, as it's been called, was actually a contest about who could build up forces fastest. And because of Sicily and Italy are closer to Tunis than, for example, Algiers, or indeed the United States or Britain, it was perhaps inevitable that the Axis forces won this race. That said, it was a much closer race than many people think, for the landings in North Africa came as a strategic surprise to the Axis powers. The race for Tunis was, as Wellington said of Waterloo, a damned close-run thing. In fact, British and American troops got to within less than 10 miles of Tunis before the Germans managed to stop them, launch a counterattack near the town of Djebel, and in this particular case, capture and hold Longstop Hill. After the failure of the race for Tunis, a kind of stalemate existed in northern Tunisia from late December 42 to about March 43. During this time, the First Army was established and grew stronger. One relevant fact, I think, is that the Germans launched a counteroffensive in February 1943, which isolated Medjez el-Bab and also seized terrain which overlooked the main supply route, the one I talked about between Beja and Medjez el-Bab. This turned Medjez into a kind of salient, one surrounded on all three sides. This brings us perhaps to our plot, or the operational plan. Why did the Battle of the Peaks take place? But first of all, let's have a quick intro into some key characters. Our first character is a division, the 78th Infantry Division, which was not a regular formation of the British Army. The division was created in 1942 by bringing together three brigades: the 11th Infantry Brigade, the 36th Infantry Brigade, and the 1st Guards Brigade. The 1st Guards Brigade would subsequently be replaced by the 38th Irish Brigade. It was known as the Battle Axe Division because Major General Vivian Everly, the General Officer Commanding, chose the battle axe as the divisional sign. That neatly brings me to my second character, Vivian Everly. Everly took command of the 78th Division in 1942 and was its commander from the Torch landings in November all the way through to Italy in December 1943. He was a substantive major in 1939 and a major general at 44, commanding the GOC 78th Division as GOC 78th Division in 1942. He was known as a tough, ambitious man who had a hot temper and was reputed to be something of a bully. The plus side was he was a very bright officer who was reputed to have an instinctive grasp of terrain and the ability to adapt his plans accordingly. During the Battle of the Peaks, Everley was ably assisted by 3 seasoned veteran brigade commanders. These included, on the left, Brigadier Edward Copper-Cass, who commanded 11 Brigade, Brigadier Bernard Swifty Howlett. Howlett was a fast bowler, that's how he got his nickname, who commanded 36 Brigade, and Brigadier Nelson Russell, who didn't have a nickname, but commanded 38 Irish Brigade. Our review of some of the actors now brings us next to our plot. That's Everley's plan for what was called Operation Sweep, and that is the code name for the Battle of the Peaks. The aim of Everley's plan is to seize back control of the main supply route that runs from Beja to Medjez el-Bab, recapture the peaks that the Germans had taken in February, take Longstop Hill, and remove the threat to Medjez el-Bab. Crucially, and I need to emphasize this is the first phase of the final battle for Tunis, to destroy the 5th German Panzer Army and eject Axis forces from Tunisia. As far as Everley is concerned, the villain in his sights in this plot is the 334th German Mountain Division, which, along with a number of other units, had temporary occupancy over the peaks or mountains stemming from Mardi in the west all the way to Longstop in the east. Each peak overlooked the other, and the Germans had used the 2 to 3 month period of the stalemate to establish excellent defensive positions. This operation was not going to be a walkover. In simple terms, Everley's plan was to launch his complete division, strengthened by other units to about a strength of 16,000 troops, in a series of coordinated attacks. His plan depended upon speed, surprise, and momentum. All 3 brigades would attack on the night of the 6th or 7th of April, together across an 8-mile front. The 38th on the left, the 36th in the middle, and the 11th on the right.
Just one quick question for you, Ian.
Absolutely.
I said I would jump in occasionally. Mark Calhoun took us through the German counteroffensives last week, and you're talking about this plan for Operation Sweep. Is it entirely put together by Everley without any consideration for what the Americans are doing elsewhere or the New Zealanders doing elsewhere, or is it part of an overall scheme for the push towards Tunis?
I think the short answer is the plan's definitely Everley under his corps commander, who's a gentleman called Lieutenant General Charles Alfrey. That fits in with the First Army, which is commanded by Anderson. There's a level of coordination that Alexander brings when he takes over in February, March.
Okay, thanks. Because we do see those maps where the various forces are moving in directions. And with hindsight, when you see the arrows moving, you could easily believe there's some kind of planning behind it. But my understanding from speaking to historians like yourself and others is that that's almost been added after the event. And most of these operations are really happening kind of in isolation, but with the same kind of general goal.
I think there's a coordination at the level of the army group, the 18th Army Group, but that wasn't established until, and I can't remember off the top of my head, but it's about February, March. And it takes time to set up an army group, coordinate things.
Okay, thanks. I'll hand it back to you. I just wanted to get that one in there. Thank you.
No, not a problem. Everley could read terrain like a book, and his analysis of the challenge he faced showed that he fully understood that seizing one peak was useless, as each peak tended to be overlooked or dominated by another. So his intention was for all his units, his brigades, were to play a game of leapfrog. And by that I mean you move forward, grab a bunch of peaks, get your hold on those, and move over on and grab another bunch of peaks. That way one is not so easily overlooked by the other. Having now sort of set the scene for you and talked you through the plan, what I want to do is actually talk about the fighting during the battle. I plan to do this by highlighting a number of actions that I believe are especially interesting, and the battalions that took part in them. When I don't cover units that your viewers might be interested in, I apologise, but I only have limited time, and this is a complex battle with quite a few moving parts. The first action that I want to cover is the capture of Djebel el Mardi. Djebel, of course, means mountain in Arabic. In his plan, Everly recognised that running through the right-left centre of his proposed advance was a valley which was occupied on the left by Djebel el Mardi. That's just to the right of Muncha on this slide. And on the right by two hill masses, Mergib Chabosh, which isn't shown here, and 0.667, which is. To deal with the first obstacle, on the night of the 6th and 7th of April, Everly launched Brigadier Nelson Russell and the wild geese of the 38th Irish Brigade on the poor unfortunate Germans who occupied Djebel el Mardi, a long slab-like hill mass, as I said, to the west of the valley. The 38th didn't exist before the war, and it was Churchill's idea to establish it, which he did despite a little bit of opposition in Northern Ireland. It was composed of 2 regular and 1 TA battalions. They were called the Wild Geese because that was the name used in the 18th century for Irishmen who served in many other European armies. At least 1/3 of the soldiers of the brigade came from Ahmera. This slide shows the names of the battalions and the commanders. The 1st Royal Irish Fusiliers are known as the Fogs, and that's my best attempt to pronounce this in Gaelic, and it's a difficult one to pronounce. Then you've got the 2nd London Irish Rifles, and you've got the 6th Royal Inniskillen Fusiliers that were known as the Skins. On the night of the 5th and 6th of April, the 6th Skins, the Inniskillens, led by Lieutenant Colonel Charles Heaver, that was his nickname, Allen, laid up in an empty riverbed or wadi just out of sight of the Germans, in an exposed position below Djebel el Mardi. Everly had taken the risk of moving a number of his battalions well forward at night in secret, and then having them lie up camouflage during the day in order to gain speed and surprise. Heaver Allen was a tough 39-year-old regular soldier who had only recently taken command of the 6 Skins, and who believed in very much leading from the front. In that evening, in the final hour before he was about to lead his battalion into the attack, his thoughts must have been about his wife, a doctor, and his young daughter, who were living in Yorkshire. At about 2300 on the 6th of April, a lance bombardier called Spike Milligan was manning the wireless set for his battery commander on a hill near Mardi, when a massive thunder and lightning show lit up the night sky. Except for this wasn't a storm. It was the guns of 12 artillery regiments firing on German positions over an 8-mile area. Milligan would later write that he cried silently because he knew this event presaged the death of many fine young men, and on that he was right. The Skins, the Inniskillens, used the knowledge gained from patrolling to quickly move up to the first main hill on the Mardi hill mass, but then were pinned down by 2 really troublesome machine guns. Keen to keep the momentum going, Heaver Allen, who was as usual up front, grabbed a brain gun and was about to engage one of the machine gun posts when sadly he was shot dead. His Irish soldiers, rather irritated by the loss of their new battalion commander, who they'd only just got used to, charged the position, killed the Germans, and then took the rest of the hill, but casualties were quite high. The Skins then watched as the Royal Irish Fusiliers leading companies passed through and advanced to the highest point, which is point 437 on this map. In a short but bitter battle, the Fogs, led by 28-year-old Major John Caldwell Horsfall, seized the peak and stopped the inevitable German counterattack. The ability of the wild geese to capture Djebel el-Mardi and several other peaks was in no small part due to the work of locally recruited mule companies. Another Irishman, Major Noel Dudgeon, a veteran of World War I, a cavalry officer, had established the first mule transport company in December 1942. By April 1943, he was commanding an entire pack transport group. The mules themselves were not altogether popular. John Horsfall called them four-legged sons of Satan. But without them, Operation Sweep would probably have been impossible. The next series of actions I want to chat about led to a famous signal being sent by the commanding officer of the 1st East Surreys, Bill Wilberforce, who I've mentioned before. And yes, he was a descendant of William Wilberforce, the anti-slavery campaigner. That signal read, "Took is took." The Took which Bill Wilberforce was referring to was a Berber hilltop village of Tukabir. This and another one, Chaush, overlooked the area from a very lofty perch in the peaks, 2,000 feet up. These are shown on the map. This series of moves that led to the capture of the two villages began on the night of the 6th and 7th of April, when in the centre and on the right, the 36th and 11th Brigades respectively attacked and captured the initial defensive belt of German positions hinged around Djebel on Nahel, shown on this map, and Jebel Utia. Acquisition of these locations by the battalions of the two brigades gave the division entry into the Long Bed Valley. On the 7th of April, battalions of the 36th Kent Brigade, which I remember was led by Brigadier Bernard Howlett, started their advance to capture the hill masses of Mergu-Chayush, shown here on the top right, and also point 667, which is Jebel Bet Chikua. It's worth briefly talking about Swifty Howlett and Bill Wilberforce, as they figure a lot later in the story. Both were excellent cricketers. Howlett got his reputation from being a fast bowler, and Wilberforce was a well-regarded batsman. Both of them were veteran commanders by the time we reached April 1943. The attack on the large hill complex of Mergu-Chayush was planned to be conducted by the 6th Royal West Kents, which Howlett had previously commanded, and the 8th Argyll and Sunderland Highlanders, all part of 36th Brigade and supported by Churchill tanks. Named after Winston himself, the new Churchill tank was specifically designed to support infantry attacks and had already assisted the 11th and the 36th Brigades in tackling that initial belt of defensive positions that we talked about. Now, on the afternoon of the 7th of April, a squadron of Churchills from the North Irish Horse Regiment, led by Major Eugene Strickland, waited impatiently for the infantry to join them. Eventually, Strickland's patience ran out, and rather than lose daylight and the opportunity, he led his Churchills up the hill and attacked the German battalion unaided. The Germans knew about the Churchill. They'd captured some of them at Dieppe, but they made bad assumptions about its mobility and its capabilities. On this afternoon, the Austrian mountain troops that held the hill watched with mounting horror as Strickland's Churchill tanks moved off the valley floor and climbed gradually steeper and steeper up the hill, shelling and machine gunning their positions as they went. Their commander could not believe his eyes, and soon afterwards was captured while many of his troops sensibly fled. Joined by the lead companies of the Argylls, the tanks ensured that Mergib Chaosh was captured. In line with Everly's doctrine, next day Strickland and a chap called Lieutenant Colonel Ginger McKechnie, the ex-stockbroker TACO of the 1st East Kent Regiment, known as the Buffs, used Mergib Chaosh to leapfrog around and then finally up Djebel Chekwar and onto the next beat, Djebel Mansourine. All these moves enabled the 11th Brigade, and especially the 2nd Lancashire Fusiliers, supported by Churchill tanks, to work their way forward to capture this hill, Point 512, a large hill which, for reasons I have never been able to work out, was codenamed Satan. Subsequently, the East Surreys, led by Wilberforce, supported by the Lancashire Fusiliers, captured both Tukabir and Chaosh, which was known as Charwash to the troops. This led to Wilberforce's famous signal. Is there anything that cropping up as questions that we need to cover?
Just quickly, there's nothing from the audience particularly yet. My question is about how much training, if any, has there been in terms of cooperation between infantry and tanks? Because it's something that came up in our shows about post-Kasserine Pass. One of the things the Americans are working on is just, integrating their troops in the field. And some of the units in Tunisia who fought through North Africa have had some prior experience, both bad and good, of working alongside the tanks. What about the 78th Division generally? Is it something that they've spent time at?
It's a good question. I'm not exactly sure what the answer is. My thinking at the moment is that there wasn't a huge amount of work done on closely integrating infantry troops with tanks before they went to Tunisia, even though the 25th Tank Brigade's job was to support those troops. Interestingly enough, I think a lot more of that happened in Italy. And if you read an excellent book called Strick, which is about Eugene Strickland, it talks about a lot of training and exercising that took place before they attacked the Gothic line. Does that help you deal with the question?
Well, definitely, yeah. I mean, I think that one of the takeaways from this campaign is that where there was cooperation that worked well, it was more accidental, and then later on, both in Italy and in Normandy, they try and address it and actually tackle it in advance. It's the overriding feeling has been during this series is that things that worked well weren't necessarily planned. They were just as a result of maybe circumstance and luck. So, and if you've got infantry units who are trained well and tank units are trained well, even if they haven't been trained to work together, they should theoretically come up with some kind of cohesion.
Yeah, I think it was more through. You've got to bear in mind that the 25th Tank Brigade didn't really arrive until February, so there was no time between November and February for them to work with those divisions. In fact, a lot of the armor in the north came initially in November, December from the Americans, but let's not divert.
Okay, thanks.
While the 11th Brigade captured the village of Tukabir and Chaosh, and I accept that this is quite a busy slide, Howlett's 36th Brigade has certainly not been resting on its laurels. After taking Djebel Chekwar and Djebel Mansourine, 0.667 on the left, Howlett had launched one of the companies of his old battalion to try and take Djebel Boudis, 0.617. This is a tactically important hill. That move was repulsed, but the following night, the whole of the battalion attacked the hill and successfully took it. The capture of Dis by the West Kents was made a lot easier because to the south, Djebel Rarif had been taken by the 1st East Surreys commanded by Wilberforce. And it enabled, and that favour was now returned because the possession of Boudis in the north meant that Wilberforce with the 1st East Surreys and the 5th North Ants were then able to then leapfrog, I suppose that's a good word, to take Djebel Meduma and Djebel Betiyar. And these are two key objectives in Everly's plan, which is primarily aimed at taking Djebel el Tanngoucha on the top right. The seizure of Djebel Betia enabled Cass, the commander of the 11th Brigade, to direct two of his battalions, the 5th Northants and also the 2nd Battalion of the Lancashire Fusiliers, to attack through Djebel El Lang towards Tanngoucha, across what's called the Kef El Tior Ridge. This modern-day photograph shows some of those key features. It shows Betia on the left, Djebel Ang centre left, the narrow Kef El Tior Ridge, centre right, and finally the lower feature called Point 622. As you can see, this photograph is taken from Djebel Tanngoucha. I think this photograph shows particularly well the rugged nature of the terrain and why the fighting was quite difficult. The first attack took place on the 14th of April in broad daylight. And unsurprisingly, given the fact the Germans had complete observation over the area, the units were heavily shelled as they started to advance. They were helped by a group of 4 Churchills that had managed to make their way amazingly onto the western end of Djebel Ang. That was the good news. The bad news is as the companies advanced, they came under extremely heavy fire, and eventually the advance stalled and the leading companies were forced to withdraw. Copper Cass and his brigade staff were forced to rethink their plans. It's worth briefly talking about Cass at this point. The reason he's called Copper is quite simple. It's reputed that he had a fiery temper, and as he grew angrier and angrier, his face grew redder and redder, thus the name Copper.
Cool.
He was a veteran of World War I, where he won the DSO and a military cross. He'd won a second DSO, commanding a battalion in Norway, and had taken command of the 11th Brigade in February 1942. He's a strict disciplinarian. By about April, he must have been getting pretty tired. He's been in command of the brigade since they landed in Algiers in November. Moreover, he's also under a lot of pressure from Everley to continue the advance. As a result, he orders an ad hoc force formed of 3 companies of the Lancashire Fusiliers and 2 companies of the Northamptonshire Regiment to make another attack. This time, the plan is to move during the night of the 15th, 16th of April, down along the slope just below Kef El Tior, and then attack uphill to take Djebel Tanngoucha. It's not the best of plans, but it might have worked. Unfortunately, and as this map shows, the British were not the only ones with plans for a counterattack. On the same night, and at roughly the same time. For as 11th Brigade was planning to launch its attack, 1 battalion of the 962nd Regiment of the 999th Division, and by the way, that's a mouthful, were planning in moving in the opposite direction. I think it perhaps worth mentioning that the soldiers of the 962nd, and indeed the 999th, were rather different. It's the kind of German equivalent of the fictional Dirty Dozen, except for there's 12,000 of these, not 12. It was a penal unit composed of petty criminals and what the Nazis called political undesirables. While the British ad hoc force moved to the east, the Germans are moving to the west. It could be said that both groups moved almost across the same ground like thieves in the night, except the Germans definitely were thieves. The German attack arrived late in the evening at a most inopportune time for the 2nd Lancaster Fusiliers headquarters, as they were due to receive some reinforcements. The battalion headquarters was at the bottom of an 80-foot escarpment. And as I'll now show in these next 2 slides. Almost the first thing the battalion headquarters knew of the attack was when German stick brigades came flying down from the top of the escarpment onto their positions. Over the next hour or 2, battalion headquarters and other forces found themselves in the heart of a fight to protect their new home from some unwanted burglars. In this they proved successful, for eventually the thieves of the 962nd retreated into the night. Sadly, the outcome of the ad hoc forces attack was not very favourable, for the attack proved to be a disaster. The 5 companies failed to take Tanngoucha, and as dawn broke, 2 companies of the Lancaster Fusiliers were found in broad daylight and were overrun. For all intents and purposes, the 11th Brigade had shot its bolt. It was no longer capable of continuing the attack.
So just a quick question for you. 3 people asked in quick succession about what sort of air support there was, if any, during this operation. I think they also they mean from the British point of view, but also the German.
The focus of most of the Royal Air Force air support was on 2 things. One, establishing air superiority. So close air support really hadn't been developed in the Royal Air Force in 1943, not as we understand it today. Strategically, they were bombing the ports. Fighters were undoubtedly providing air superiority, and there's a limited amount of tactical attacks locally. There is an attack actually in support of the Longstop battle, but most of this is about establishing superiority. Bearing in mind that from November 1942 all the way through almost to February 1943, the Luftwaffe were in charge of the skies. I think we're moving on. Are we moving on?
Please. Yep.
Over the next couple of days, as I said, Cass's brigade was in fact relieved by Brigadier Nelson Russell's 38th Irish Brigade. They would fight their own battles to take Tanngoucha and Point 622, the ridge I talked about. Much though I'd like to have described those actions, and I'm sure there's somebody who's watching Richard O'Sullivan would like me to have done so, time simply precludes me from doing so, because one of the things I want to do is talk about Longstop Hill. However, it's really important to know that without the success of the Irish Brigade in taking Tanngoucha, it would not have been possible for Howlett's brigade to take Longstop Hill. While Nelson Russell's wild geese were hurling themselves against Djebel Tanngoucha, Everley was under some pressure to attack Longstop Hill. Cass's brigade was battered, Russell's was occupied, but didn't leave much choice, so Everley ordered Swifty Howlett to plan and prepare an attack on Longstop Hill. Past experience, bitter experience, had shown that Longstop Hill, as shown in this photograph, was actually a series of heights, with 2 standing out: Djebel Ahmera and its ridge leading to it on the right here, and Djebel El Ra on the left. This photograph, by the way, is taken from Tanngoucha and shows just how dominating that feature was. Apart from its tactical importance, guarding the road to Djebel and Tunis, the hill had become something of a symbol of an Allied offensive that had bogged down and German tenacity in the defence. Its capture could lift morale. Howlett had very little time to plan and prepare the attack. He got his orders only 36 hours beforehand. His brigade was the strongest, and it was reinforced by Bill Wilberforce's battalion and artillery. Pressure to capture Longstop meant that, though viable, Howlett's plan was fairly simple, though a little optimistic. It required a frontal assault on the night of the 21st, 22nd by the whole brigade. This is a bit of a busy slide, but as the map shows, the plan was for the 1st East Surreys and the 6th West Kents to seize an intermediate start line, point 220, to enable the Argylls to then pass through that night and take Djebel Ahmera. Subsequently, the plan was for the 5th Buffs to go on to capture Djebel El Ra. In essence, that's actually what happens, but the timescale was arguably very optimistic. To use a cricket analogy, Howlett's first innings at Longstop Hill was a bit of a mixed bag. The initial 2-battalion night assault quickly bogged down in the face of tenacious German resistance. So it was not possible to seize the start line. This photograph shows roughly that area. This is the start line for the 8th Argylls to take Djebel Ahmera. It left Howlett with a rather difficult problem, for he would, for operations south of the river, were very dependent upon Longstop being captured. Howlett decided he would have to send in his main reserve, the 8th Battalion, the Argyll and Southern Highlanders, in broad daylight to capture Ahmera. The Argylls were a veteran battalion with seasoned NCOs and officers, but their commanding officer was new. Colin McNabb had only recently assumed command of the battalion. Before that, he'd been Anderson's key staff officer as a brigadier. He'd taken a serious demotion from brigadier to lieutenant colonel to command the battalion. At about 11:30 in the morning, McNabb sent his leading companies into the attack across fields strewn with poppies and followed them close behind. As the battalion crossed the open ground to get to the ridgeline leading up to Ahmera, the Germans, who must have been a bit surprised, nonetheless opened up with everything they had. Observers watching the advance would have specifically seen McNabb's headquarters group targeted by mortar and artillery shells, which exploded in bursts around them. Unsurprisingly, 38-year-old Colin McNabb, along with many of his staff, were killed. Meanwhile, the leading companies were getting hit hard by machine gun fire and mortars, and losing officers and men very quickly. It must have seemed inevitable to the Germans and to other observers that this attack was going to fail. The Highlanders and their only remaining but not unwounded company commander, Major Jack Anderson, had other ideas. Anderson had made it to the bottom of the ridge leading to Ahmera, and without knowing what happened to his CO, took command of those troops that were around him. He quickly made the decision to continue the attack. Jack Anderson graduated from Cambridge in 1939, but he'd enlisted as a soldier in the autumn, had been commissioned then in the Argyll and Southern Highlanders. He'd narrowly escaped being captured in the BF in France. Married in 1940, had a daughter. He rose quickly in the battalion. He was a lieutenant in 1942, but by January 1943, he was an acting major and commanded a company. He got a DSO for outstanding bravery at a place called Hunt's Gap in 1943, and many people believe that should have been a Victoria Cross. On this particular day, Anderson and the Highlanders proved to be the nemesis of the German garrison on Ahmera. Anderson personally led a group of Highlanders in the attack up until the first rise of the ridge that leads to Ahmera. It can truly be said that Anderson literally led from the front, for he initially alone attacked 3 German positions, one after the other, giving each one, as he later wrote, a full Thompson submachine gun magazine. At the first rise, they'd captured a few German prisoners. One of them grabbed a machine pistol, despite the fact he'd surrendered, and shot at Highlanders, before he, in turn, was killed. This incident is reputed to have enraged the Highlanders and perhaps made them more determined to capture the hill. Jack Anderson would later write that we just had a hate for the Germans, the hill, and everything. When Anderson resumed his advance, his situation was quite perilous, for he only had a small band of about 4 officers and 30 soldiers. Over the next couple of hours, it was this small group of Highlanders, led by Anderson, but also by NCOs and officers, who made their way up the slope, first to point 220, and then finally to the top of the hill by 4 o'clock. These 2 photographs help show the first of all, on the left, top left, the view down Ahmera along the Argyle's attack route up. Bear in mind that in those days, most of this was bare. The second one, bottom right, perhaps shows the amazing view over the valley and its tactical importance. The hold on Ahmera, having captured it, was rather tenuous, for Anderson had relatively few men, and they were exhausted. Moreover, a counter-attack seemed inevitable. It's just fortunate that Bill Wilberforce and the East Surreys had followed the Argyles. By about 1800, 6 o'clock in the evening, the leading companies had arrived on top of Ahmera, the East Surreys, and soon afterwards, Bill Wilberforce. He quickly assumed local command. It was typical of him that he moved around on top of the hill, wearing a soft cap, puffing on his trademark pipe, reorganizing the area while constantly exposing himself to enemy fire. By late evening, Howlett's hold on Djebel Ahmera was secured. He had won his second innings. The capture of Djebel Ahmera against great odds by the Argyles must rank as one of the finest feats of arms of the British Army in World War II. Swifty Howlett was in no doubt that in large measure that was due to Jack Anderson's leadership and the bravery of the Highlanders. Past experience, however, had shown that taking Djebel Ahmera did not mean that Longstop itself was secure. Howlett had to capture Jebel el Ra. The task of taking Jebel el Ra was assigned to the 5th Buffs, and on this occasion, the plan was to carry out that attack once again in daylight. But this time, the Germans are going to have a very nasty surprise. It had taken time, but Howlett and Everly had suddenly become avid fans of using Churchill tanks with the infantry to attack targets. Thus it was, excuse me, I'm out slightly I'm out a little bit in terms of slides, but here we go. Howlett unleashed two squadrons of the North Irish Horse up the valley to the north of Djebel Ahmera. The Churchills would support the 5th Buffs in their attack on that hill. What we then see is the leading troop of B Squadron of the North Irish Horse, and interestingly enough, very recently the North Irish Horse have returned to Tunisia. I can say that now since they're back. Rapidly moved well ahead of the Buffs, who had been delayed by shelling. At some point during these proceedings, Major Russell, who commanded B Squadron, and Ginger McKechnie, who commanded the Buffs, consulted by radio, and it was decided to let the tanks go ahead unaided. Thus it was, much to the astonishment and horror of the Germans, the Churchills crewed by the North Irish Horse climbed up the very slopes that the Germans believed were impassable. However, as we know, Churchills were fully capable of doing this. One of the tank's troops worked its way up the steep re-entrant into a gully that exists between Ahmera and Ra. The picture shows the area where this roughly happened. This is an original photograph. If you look carefully in the center, you'll probably see one of the two tanks that actually carried out the final operation. At 11:45 in the morning, confronted by these tanks and the Buffs, the Germans threw in the towel and either surrendered or withdrew, and thus relinquished their hold on Djebel el Ra and also Longstop Hill. Any lingering doubts about the value of Churchills were smashed at Longstop. The enemy had his last word on that subject, for the captured battalion commander who held Ra said, while interrogated, and I quote, "Djebel Ra is the strongest defensive position that anyone could hope to occupy. I would have held it against any brigade attack, but when it became apparent that tanks were used over high ground, I knew it was all over." And that, as they say, largely brings our story towards its final curtain. So how do we conclude the story? Well, I think, first of all, we can accurately say that the Battle of the Peaks and Longstop are a vital, if often overlooked, part of the final battle for Tunis. That final battle took place in early May as part of the latter phases of Vulcan and what became known as Operation Strike. Contrary to popular legend, the operations were commanded and executed by Kenneth Anderson and the First Army. Though in fairness, it should be said that some of Monty's formation were moved across to the First Army. It is fair, I believe, to say that without Operation Sweep, that successful battle would never have taken place. Operation Strike led to the defeat and surrender of all the Italian forces in Tunisia, a figure usually estimated to be around 250,000 troops. The Allied victory in North Africa has often been overlooked, but it was a body blow to the Axis powers and one that led quickly to the surrender of Italy. So my first observation in conclusion is to say that the operations in April are much more important than many historians have indicated and deserve more study, as does actually the Tunisian campaign. My second conclusion is that the men who fought and died in the campaign have received very little attention over the years and frankly deserve a lot more recognition for their sacrifice. It's perhaps appropriate now to finish this story by talking about a few of them. I suppose it won't be any surprise for your viewers to know that Jack Anderson was recommended for and received an immediate Victoria Cross for his outstanding leadership and bravery at Djebel Ahmera. Swifty Howlett won a second DSO, Wilberforce won his first. Some 350 gallantry awards were made during this period. Tunisia was obviously not the end, it was only the beginning of the end, and the men of the 78th went on to fight for another 2 years in Sicily and Italy. It'll thus come also as a no huge surprise to you that the division had its losses. Swifty Howlett was killed in the Battle of Sangro, and Bill Wilberforce, unfortunately, didn't even survive the final battle. He was pinning on the ribbon of his new DSO when he's killed by one of the last shells of the campaign. Finally, and more sadly, Jack Anderson was killed at Termoli in Italy in September 1943, almost certainly and ironically by friendly shell fire. He left a widow and a daughter. His great friend at Stowe, where both learned out to become pilots, interesting enough, Leonard Cheshire, would also go on to win the VC. Anderson and Howlett lie within yards of each other of the Sangro Cemetery in Italy. Over the next 2 years, the 78th Division would suffer a large number of casualties before the end of the war came. These men, and in supposedly Lady Astor's misquoted words, were the D-Day Dodgers who fought in Tunisia and later in sunny, or perhaps not so sunny, Italy. Those who now rest in Tunisia have received no praise, no recognition, and are rarely visited where they lie in Tunisia. So I ask you in conclusion to try and not forget them. And that's me.
Well, brilliant. Well, and again, Richard is watching, and Edmund has been some great help, and of course the maps have been fantastic. So that's been cool. So we have a quick one question from where is it back? Terry Down, who is asking. Kenneth Maxey writes about a German counterattack flinging the British off Longstop after the 78th Division took it. Did that happen?
Yes, it did in December 1942. Yeah. Times, there's only so much time to cover things. So there's a first Battle of Longstop in December 1942. The 78th Division acquire it. The Tabuba counterattack happens. The 78th Division with the Guards attempt to retake Longstop on Christmas Day, round about Christmas Day, 1942. The Germans counterattack and throw them and the Americans, and by the way, there's an American battalion involved, off the hill.
Okay, thank you. So, talking about the Irish Brigade, Ian Carr is asking, was it 30% of the men in the Irish Brigade were from Ahmera? How were the troops from Ahmera received back in Ireland after the war? So I mean, they're from a forgotten campaign largely, and then they go back to a country. Is there a general response to that, or does it vary?
It varies. I think the figure 30% is right. The expert on the Irish Brigade is Richard O'Sullivan.
He may jump in the comments. Yeah.
In terms of how they're greeted, in some cases, if you've been in the Irish Army and then you leave to go join the British Army, when you return, you're considered to have deserted. And many of them, if I recall correctly, and I'm not an expert on this particular matter, actually had real problems with getting their pensions. Wow. So you've got to bear in mind that Ahmera, Republic of Ireland, was a neutral nation, and it was trying to desperately to maintain that status.
Okay,
but nonetheless, it does seem a little harsh.
Okay, I'm going to ask you the same question I've pretty much been asking every guest there. Yeah, the German reinforcements to Tunisia after El Alamein, was it folly? Was it stupid? What's your opinion on it? Was it Hitler's hubris and pride? Was there a strategic reason behind it? Do you have an opinion on it?
It's a tough question. I think there was a point at which he was recommended by his commanders to pull the troops out when they had control of the sea lanes that would enable them to do that. I think initially my thinking is that strategically it was a sound move to send troops to Tunisia because it protected the flank of Rommel's army. So that really was a bit of a no-brainer. The argument then becomes when he didn't then agree to the withdrawal of the troops when they had air cover and a degree of control of the sea, which was limited. I mean, submarines and aircraft eventually were to cause havoc. So the initial decision, in summary, is sound. The decision to keep holding on right to the end perhaps is not so. No,
definitely. Referring back to your comment about the Tunisian campaign being largely overlooked, which really echoes what we've been saying these last 2 weeks. Now I'm 2/3, 3/4 of the way through this series. I was with historians this week, and you take something like the Italian campaign. Monte Cassino is a label that a lot of people understand what it means. Now, in fact, Monte Cassino wasn't just about the fight for the casino on that single hill. There were other peaks, there were other ridges, there's other areas there. We've talked about it a little bit on this channel there, but it gave that larger campaign a really good label. I think apart from the landings at Torton, maybe Casablanca is a good name. I suppose Kasserine Pass, but that's not got positive connotations because of the American defeat there. But apart from that, you don't get any really big labels till you get to Tunis. And I don't even know that taking Tunis is a really big label. And I think because of that, all these little, and I'm using that with no disrespect to those who fought in it, these little battles for little hills, and the British are doing the same as the Americans, doing the same as in New Zealand, etc., etc. There's not one big dominant name that has left the world with that kind of label to pin their interest on. Does that make sense to you, that theory?
In a sense, yes. Although it's interesting to note that many of those fought in Tunisia and at Cassino said Tunisia was the more difficult battle.
Yeah.
I'm not sure the Americans would agree with that because Kasserine certainly sits in the American mind.
Yeah.
And bear in mind that British troops were involved in the Battle of Kasserine Pass. I believe the Guards and a number of other units.
Yeah.
And then there's Thala and Sabiba, which are linked into that. So from the American point of view, Kasserine always figures in the national psyche. Less so, actually, interesting enough, the American campaign in northern Tunisia from April to May, which is where some important units get to learn their trade really, really well. In terms of the British, well, I think the one is that you might better hinge, if you'll excuse the pun, Longstop partly as part of that in terms of understanding the thing. But there are a range of other things going on where the casualties are quite high. It's just that Tunisia has just been ignored. It's kind of the word I've used in the past with friends and colleagues is that it's been airbrushed from history.
Yeah, I mean, it airbrush. I'm half with you, but it also suggests a deliberate attempt to kind of block it somehow, which I think I would disagree with that. I think something can be forgotten without it being deliberate. It just is less memorable than something else. So I'm maybe with you on that, but and I'll let you respond if you want to. But I have got a couple more questions. So back when you were talking about the attack on the peaks, there were a couple of questions about artillery support, and of course, for so many people, myself included, my first understanding of this battle was Spike Milligan's account, and Spike, of course, is out there in artillery. There is obviously artillery in the area. In your interpretation of the battle, is more the problem about having the accuracy because you need forward observers, you need spotters in a terrain that's very difficult? Give us a little rundown, if you wouldn't mind, about how artillery was used, perhaps effectively and ineffectively in that battle, or that series of battles, I should say.
Well, I've served with the gunners, so I'm well aware of how they're viewed. Their motto is ubique, which some in the British Army means everywhere, and some of the British Army mean that's exactly where the Royal Artillery drop their shells.
Yeah.
But on this occasion, I think the important thing is that the Royal Artillery in Tunisia are a very professional organisation. Artillery plays a critical role in winning the Battle of the Peaks. There are loads of examples of the forward observers helping to win that battle with all types of artillery. The 78th Division and 5th Corps had much more artillery, much more liberal use of it than the Germans did, and that was a critical asset in stopping counterattacks. I think there's a kind of a quote from a sergeant major that got captured, I remember off my book, where he said that he'd been at Stalingrad and he'd not encountered anywhere near the level of artillery fire that they'd actually met. I believe that was on Djebel when they were counterattacking. So the artillery plays a key role. They're very professional, and it's really one of the reasons why they win.
Yeah, and you could definitely argue that that's one of Montgomery's takeaways is keep on having more artillery, keep on refining the artillery process, take some of the ideas from North Africa. Generally, we've talked about it before, from New Zealanders, from the Australians, the idea of the stonks, and take that into Italy, take it into Normandy, take it into Germany, and allow steel to save Allied lives by barrage rather than advance. So that's something there. I want to bring up Trevor Sheehan's really good point, because Trevor's going to be on next week on Monday, and he has just recently come back from Tunisia. He has walked these battlefields many times, and so his comment is a comment question. He says, the thing that always gets me when I've walked on those peaks is how they navigated in 1943 at night and under fire. Did any units cross over their boundaries? It's a really good question.
Yeah, first of all, by April 1943, these units were well trained. Officers and NCOs were well trained in using compasses and maps and doing it at night over rugged terrain. They also did quite a bit of reconnaissance, so a lot of patrols have been done before they can launch the attack on April the 7th. And for instance, there's a guy called Captain Emerton, the intelligence officer. He literally took his intelligence section, I think it's the 5th North Ants, and he laid out white tape and everything so that they could guide the first units from their start lines almost onto the German positions. But yeah, the area around Kefel-Tior, Djebel and around there is really difficult to navigate. And moreover, there was confusion. At one point, there were reports that Djebel was actually held by the Germans when actually it was held by a British unit. And it's in real terms, the way that they managed it is because they were experienced, they trained for it. The artillery helped because when you're pounding the hell out of your objective, it's a bit easier to understand where you're going. But they'd also done a lot of patrolling, and they were good at navigating a rough ground. But it wasn't without its errors. It's a good question.
Yeah,
I'll have to think about that.
I mean, Richard O'Sullivan is joining, and he's saying there was lots of mixing up. He's saying that was definitely an issue. So there is something. And then Ian Carr is asking about radios? Is there a lack of radios? How is wireless communication generally? I mean, how are with the quite sharp ridges and heights there? Is there any issue with radio signals not traveling or not carrying or failing to reach? Anything that you can think of that's relevant to this conversation?
I mean, there's a couple of things. One is the wireless sets were really heavy then. I mean, they had to use the mules to do it. And there's a great story about, I can't remember, Richard will be able to tell you because he's definitely the expert on the Irish Brigade. And I must admit, it's been 2 years since I've written the book and I haven't reread it from cover to cover, surprisingly. But there's definitely an incident where they're trying to get the radio up to the battalion. The mules don't like it because they're getting shelled. And quite sensibly, they decide to remove themselves from the situation. But to go back to the original question, they're heavy, so you've got them at battalion and company level. I've not come across anything that suggests that communications were really interrupted in all the war diaries. One of the things that it certainly stands out is that the artillery nets functioned really effectively and were very responsive and very well done because they had the artillery observation parties. For instance, Spike Milligan was part of one of those. I'd have to re-look at it, and it's something perhaps I should know about.
No, well, you can't be expected to know everything. I have authors who struggle to remember their previous book. I was struggled to remember what I was doing last week. I think my last kind of comment, and we will bring things to an end, is you talked about the battle being largely forgotten. And David O'Keefe suggested it's fallen through the cracks rather than kind of been dropped. I mean, it's all the use of language. Is that you were apologizing that there was no need to for how complicated some of your slides were today, and they are in your book in color, and people can stop and look at them. But that's explaining essentially one smaller series of battles. I think for people are recommending Rick Atkinson's trilogy that covers the Tunisian campaign. But if you're going to try and break down the American campaign, British, New Zealand, there's a lot of map work involved in that. There's a lot of complicated battles. There's German counterattacks. You said yourself, going in this opposite direction at the same time as a British attack is going in. It's not the easiest of ones to break down and explain in a single volume, isn't it? There are other, I think even the Western Desert campaign, you get to things like, Crusader, or later on, El Alamein. I think you can make a fairly simple map with not that many arrows and explain Al Alamein quite effectively. But the Tunisian campaign, especially that March, April, May period, there's a lot of arrows going in a lot of different directions. It's a lot to get your head around.
It's very mountainous. There are a lot of peaks. There's a lot of movement, and to be frank, it was not that easy to put it together and write it down. I'm sure I could still have done a better job, but at some point you've got to stop and finish the book. Fighting in mountains is not something, for instance, that the 8th Army have had a great deal experience of, even under Montgomery. And there is an argument that when they moved to Sicily and subsequently to the Adriatic in Italy, Monty doesn't find it so darned easy. He's a great critic of Kenneth Anderson and the First Army. He calls them amateurs, untrained, unteachable, in his usual fashion. But when he actually attacks Tacruna and Enfielderville, the 8th Army, to put it crudely, gets handed its a certain part of its anatomy. And later, when they're in Italy, it's a really difficult campaign because they haven't had any opportunity to fight in mountains. Arguably, there is a bit of fighting 4th Indian Division further down, so perhaps I'm being a bit blanket in my views, but I think it's an important point.
No, definitely, and it's come up with the presentations with Kevin and others, is that there's an awful lot of terrain variation in Tunisia as well, which, I mean, there's variation in the Western Desert too, but I think that the extremes of variation, and Trevor, who's been back there recently, would probably agree, it's come up with the weather. There was sleet and what have you in the early part of 1943, so ridiculously cold at some points, ridiculously hot at other times, wadis, mountains, flat bits, green bits, trees, rocks. Tunisia has a bit of everything, so that adds another layer of complications in that, kind of, if you're talking about the Western Desert, once you've defined its desert, and I know desert, there isn't just one type of desert, but it does paint a a more useful overview of what the terrain is like. Whereas Tunisia, everybody's facing something slightly different. So I think we're all agreed that the Tunisia campaign needs some new studies, and I hope that perhaps as technology improves and people are talking about the Google Earth and access like that, and maybe we can start making contact with historians who are working in Tunisia, in Morocco, in Algeria, and Algeria, and what have you, and they can start combining, and maybe in 20 years' time we'll have some really good, new, fantastic books about this campaign. Because at its heart, for me, the starting point was Spike Milligan's account. There is some really good first-person account to base more modern research on. So I'm rambling now, but when we talk about the 14th Army in Burma, we can't go back in time and get accounts by Indian and West African and East African soldiers.
Yeah, that's definitely a gap. The Indian Army is fascinating, and particularly not so much. I mean, obviously the 14th Army is really interesting, but just as much as a kind of forgotten army is the Indian Army in Italy. The 8th Indian Division, the 10th Indian Division, and the 4th Indian Division. And I've certainly recently studied a little bit of that, and it's a kind of a fascinating picture. But there are it is a forgotten campaign. My view is that some of that is accidental, some of it, dare I say, and I'm not being bitter at all, but perhaps there is a bit of me that says that, is that Monty's spin merchants and the War Department wanted Monty on a pedestal. The 8th Army did everything because they'd won a victory at El Alamein. The first victory, according to Montgomery. I must have a problem with my memory because I thought O'Connor won the first victory in Libya in 1940. But it's about spinning. I'm afraid some of this is about spinning.
No, you're definitely right on that. I would not disagree. And also that fundamental principle that for the professional military historian, those for whom it's their living, there are certain subjects where books will sell better than others, and it's Dam Busters and Colditz and SAS and these are authors that I respect and admire who do this kind of work. But with all the will in the world, books on the Tunisian campaign will struggle a little bit more against Operation Market Garden and my backyard here, Normandy. So, it's out there for historians. It's a blank canvas. There is so little comparatively work on Tunisia. If there's someone out there who's 25 years old, who's finishing their PhD and is thinking about which area to go into, there's quite an open field in Tunisia to study it. No pun intended about the fact some of it being open fields. So there is opportunity for someone to take these stories forward and build on the research by your people like yourself and Richard and Trevor Sheehan and these others who've done the hard work of starting some books, but there's the next level we can go to. But we will bring things to an end. Thank you very much for your questions, everybody. I will see everybody again next Monday for more discussions about torture in Tunis. And Ian, it's been an absolute pleasure listening to you. You know your subject. And folks, I will hold up that book again. Remember, you get a discount if you go and use the link in the description below and have yourself a really good battlefield read. So thank you, everybody, for watching. Ian, did you enjoy it?
My pleasure. I think I have enjoyed it now, but there was the odd nerve when I started.
I know you're a bit nervous. I'm always nervous just before a show. Then once I start, I'm all relaxed. But cheers, everybody. Have a great weekend. I will see you all next week on Monday. This is Paul Woodhead for World War II TV saying cheerio, and until next time. Bye.
Good night.